World War I marked the waning days of the colonial project. The traditional colonial powers, Britain and France in particular, were exhausted, and the new players on the global stage, the United States and the Soviet Union, expressed ideologies steadfastly opposed, at least in principle, to the practice of colonialism. But the political context set the stage for the project of economic development that would follow, and it's precisely this political context that we will explore now. You'll recall from the previous module that there were two broad periods of decolonization. The first took place primarily in the first part of the 19th century and was dominated by Latin America's push for independence from Spain and Portugal. The second began with the independence of India in 1947 and lasted through the mid-1990s when South Africa finally established itself as a non-racial democracy. Today, only a handful of non-self-governing territories remain in the world. These are mostly small island states, like American Samoa, Bermuda, Guam, the British and US Virgin Islands, and the Falkland Islands. Many of these non-self-governing territories have been granted referenda on independence and have chosen to retain their unique status as protectorates of the United States, Britain, France, or Spain. Thus, we can effectively say that the era of colonization, at least in the traditional sense, has drawn to a close. The era of decolonization, particularly in the post-World War II phase, was driven by a couple of factors. Remember that the colonies were intended to generate revenue, or at least not to cost the colonizing country anything. But in the aftermath of World War II, it became increasingly clear that most colonies represented a significant expense for the colonial power. And strategies of nonviolent resistance, like those employed by Gandhi in India, and the guerrilla wars against colonial occupation, like those against France in Algeria and Vietnam, only served to drive up the cost of administering the colonies. The colonial powers, whose economies had been depleted by the war, thus increasingly viewed colonies as a liability rather than as a source of revenue. Further, the principle of national self-determination, which held in essence that nations had the right to determine their own futures and oversee their own affairs, had taken hold. National self-determination had been part of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and was central to the founding of the League of Nations. The Charter of the United Nations, signed in San Francisco in 1945, proclaimed, quote, the respect for the principle of human rights and national self-determination of peoples as one of the primary aims of the organization. At the same time, the Cold War brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the fore, replacing Britain and France as the most influential countries in the world. The dominant ideology of the United States, a politics rooted in liberal individualism, an economy founded on free trade capitalism, was antithetical to the idea of colonialism. Similarly, the Soviet ideology of communism was at least rhetorically opposed to the idea of colonization. Indeed, as the push towards decolonization progressed, many guerrilla movements, from Asia to Africa to Latin America, embraced communism as a part of their liberation ideology. As a result, neither the Americans nor the Soviets were willing to embrace colonialism as part of their formal worldview. The post-World War II era of decolonization was sparked by the independence for India in 1947. Remember that India was arguably the most important British colony. It was Britain's most important source of cotton and jute, both of which were essential for British industrialization. India was also a key producer of spices and tea that defined the English lifestyle. By the turn of the 20th century, India was generating more wealth than the rest of the British Empire combined, and it was a captive market for British manufactured goods. India was also symbolically important as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Not surprisingly, much of British colonial policy can be understood as a function of British interests in India. Why did Britain fight the Dutch for control of South Africa? Because South Africa was a key transit point and natural stopover for British ships sailing to and from India. Why did Britain push so hard against France for control over Egypt? Because control over Egypt gave them control of the Suez Canal, dramatically cutting times to and from India. Why did Britain fight Russia for control of Afghanistan? Because Afghanistan was seen as a natural barrier preventing Russian expansion into India. So, when the British gave in to long-standing Indian demands for independence in 1947, it marked a fundamental shift in British colonial policy and signaled to the rest of the British Empire that decolonization and independence was now a matter of when, not if. For if Britain was unwilling to fight to retain colonial possession of India, it seemed unlikely they would fight to retain control of more far-flung colonies. The first African country to achieve independence was Ghana in 1957, a decade after India's independence. By then, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan could speak of the winds of change sweeping across Africa, noting that whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We must accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it. Macmillan's speech, delivered on February 3, 1960, to the all-white South African Parliament, was coldly received. But the speech signaled an important and dramatic shift in British colonial policy, and its impact was felt almost immediately. Within just a few years, most of Africa would have its independence. But remember the changing global context into which these states were being born. Anglo-French rivalry had been supplanted by American-Soviet rivalry of the Cold War, and both the United States and the Soviet Union were eager to recruit allies to their respective sides. Knowing the fundamental challenges faced by new post-colonial states were centered on the question of economic development, both American and Soviet governments promised extensive material aid. They also both proclaimed that their economic system was most appropriate to achieve development in the global South. Today, it's easy to dismiss the promise of economic development under a communist system as sheer fantasy. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 signaled a broader shift away from communism as a viable economic system. But in the 1960s, the shortcomings of communism were not as clear. After all, the United States had taken over 100 years to industrialize, a feat which communist Russia managed to accomplish in less than 1/4 of that amount of time. From the perspective of the Third World, then, the communist model represented both a viable and an attractive alternative to capitalist development. In this context, developing a model of capitalist development that could shorten the 100-year time frame was a central priority for American foreign policy. That's why in 1945, President Harry S. Truman would describe an emerging era of development, observing that more than half of the people in the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their poverty is a handicap and a threat both to them and to more prosperous areas. For the first time in human history, humanity possesses the knowledge and the skills to relieve the suffering of these people. I believe that we should make available to peace-loving peoples the benefits of our store of technical knowledge in order to help them realize their aspirations for a better life. The old imperialism, exploitation for foreign profit, has no place in our plans. What we envision is a program of development based on the concepts of democratic fair dealing. And it is this vision of development that came in the form of modernization theory, which we'll explore in a later lecture.